The irony, of course, is that of all of those US-dominated multilateral institutions, the WTO, the World Bank and so on, is that even dominance isn't enough for them. They want everybody else to submit to their rules while they do whatever they like. Thanks very much. It's their world and we're just lucky to live in it. That's the rules-based international order. They break the rules, and what are we going to do about it? Well, in Europe's case, we don't even pretend to try and do anything about it anymore.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the 6th installment of the monthly Daily, this time for the month of July 2023. And today there will be talks by Clare Daly and by Mick Wallace, and there will be one also by Sandra Pereira of the left group of the European Parliament, just to show that there's more than just one voice in this parliament that actually speaks out against hypocrisy, especially when it comes to issues like resolutions on Venezuela or on journalistic issues like how Julian Assange is still in prison as the European Union debates protecting journalists in its own jurisdiction. So for the month of July, please enjoy.
Thank you, President. I think it's really appropriate that we are talking about the protection of journalists from abuse of court proceedings. But I think we have to be honest about it, that it doesn't really get much more abusive than depriving somebody of their liberty. In that sense, I think it was very appropriate for people to refer to journalists like Julian Assange. 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, 4 years in a high-security prison in Belmarsh in England for having the audacity to hold US empire to account, outing the war crimes committed by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while criminals who caused that war like Bush and Blair walk free, Julian Assange is currently awaiting judgment any day now, which could see him extradited to the US, where his life will be in grave danger. What about Pablo Gonzalez, Basque journalist, 16 months in a Polish jail without a charge, extended pre-trial detention, not a single phone call with his family, limited visits. This is absolutely scandalous. If it was happening in Belarus and Iran, we'd be shouting and roaring about it. It's time to do something about these cases. Irish people love to talk. Thank you, Chairman. For all of the bravado about the vibrant European industry, the CHIPS Act actually is just another example of Europe scrambling to respond to unilateral US moves to protect its interests, something the US always does with zero care for the consequences of anybody else. And the irony, of course, is that of all of those US-dominated multilateral institutions, the WTO, the World Bank and so on, is that even dominance isn't enough for them. They want everybody else to submit to their rules while they do whatever they like. Thanks very much. It's their world and we're just lucky to live in it. That's the rules-based international order. They break the rules, and what are we going to do about it? Well, in Europe's case, we don't even pretend to try and do anything about it anymore. We sheepishly submit to his master's voice, lob a few billion subsidies at European capitalists to keep them quiet, and hope that the public money doesn't run out before the US ends and stops its mad quest to shove China into a box and lock it there. Because that isn't going to happen, and it's about time Europe got itself out from under the coattails of our misnamed like-minded partner.
Thank you very much. Also on the European Chips Act, Mr. Mick Wallace.
Thanks very much, President. The EU Chips Act will involve a massive transfer of public subsidies to private corporations without a guaranteed fair return on investment for society or conditionalities on public funding. Industrial policy can work to improve livelihoods and benefit the population, but this Act won't do that. Additionally, there is a threat that this will lead to a further move away from trade with China. There is a global struggle for control of chip manufacturing, with export controls on US chips to China and a retaliatory restriction on the export of raw materials from China to the US. Our biases here have been exposed by the fact that the Commission has flagged the Chinese export conditions as potential violations of the so-called rules-based international order, while no such accusations have been levelled at the US. And as my colleague said, these rules-based international order are something the US make up as to go along, sadly with our support. The EU Chips Act thankfully does not go down the US path of hitting China with export controls, though the text leaves room for this possibility in the future. In all of this, it's vital that the EU forges an independent path. An eye for an eye only leaves everyone blind. And just one word to the Commissioner. I want to compliment the Commissioner on all the work he's done on trying to get nature restoration across the line against the absolute madness of what's gone on in this House for months. And fair play to you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague.
It's been crazy.
Thank you, President. On Palestine, EU politics takes place in a sort of a never-never land where things can be both true and untrue at the same time. We skirt around the details of our reality. We refuse to accurately name Zionism as practiced as a European settler colonial project. Israel is an occupying power. Palestinians are a colonised people. The division of the West Bank, the checkpoints, the separate control regimes, the settlements and annexations, the systemic denial of rights. These are the crimes of apartheid. Israeli airstrikes on Gaza in May, 33 dead, hundreds wounded. This isn't self-defence, it's a war crime. The slaughter of children from the air in Jenin, not self-defence, war crimes, illegal, without anything on comment out of the European Union, while the Commission President toasts the birthday of Israel's occupation of Palestine as the realisation of a dream. Palestinians have a right to engage in resistance. Our duty under international law is to use diplomatic means to bring about an end to the intolerable conditions they live under. But until we stop rewarding Israel,
please come to an end. Thank you.
For more than 2 days last week, the Israeli Defence Forces attacked the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied territories of the West Bank. Benjamin Netanyahu labelled the attack on one of the world's most defenceless and impoverished areas as a special operation. It reminds one of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, which we rightly condemned. But where's the condemnation of Israel? As reported by the excellent Jeffrey St. Clare, the IDF targeted Jenin's entire population and the fragile infrastructure the camp depends on for its survival: power plants, pipelines, electrical lines, cell towers, sewage treatment facilities, roads, schools, mosques and clinics. When the UN is helpless and the Palestinian Authority, which is responsible for security in the occupied territories, acts as a subcontractor for the Israeli state, serving only to police Palestinians and not secure them from external attack, is it any wonder paramilitaries have risen up to defend neighbourhoods and families against such blood-soaked incursions? The Israeli treatment of Palestinians is barbaric and the EU is complicit.
Thanks, President. The Commission's Rule of Law report flags the reform of the TV licence in Ireland as something that's ongoing. Well, it's ongoing all right for the past decade with absolutely no results, but not anymore. As we sit here, the country is in uproar. We're in the midst of emergency sessions of Parliament against the weeks of revelations about a staggering culture of excess at our national broadcaster, RTE. €5,000 spent on flip-flops for a party, concerts, dinners, private members' clubs, open chequebooks for VIP hospitality while journalists work out of cafe toilets. 150,000 secretly funnelled for a star celebrity while everyone else has to tighten their belts. Well, the public is furious, and rightly so. When we agree to fund our public broadcaster, we don't sign up for a slush fund to pay the lives of the rich in their parties. Is it any wonder that this institution toes the line of government so the party can continue? It's about time the Irish government dumped the licence, continue to argue and change the system for a proper public service journalism, and RTE should be committed to delivering that. The pantomime is rolling on in Ireland, but the government really needs to fix it, and the Commission really needs to keep a better eye on them. Thank you, President. Why is it that every irregularity in Venezuela, real or imagined, gets a debate and a resolution in here, but when the same thing actually happens in other countries, it barely registers? 2 weeks ago, there was an election in Guatemala. The government had been shutting down newspapers, forcing judges into exile. Our own EU observation mission documented that opposition parties were arbitrarily blocked, bogus legal challenges from registering candidates, limiting the field. Despite all of that, the people went to the polls and, shock horror, they made sure that a Social Democrat got to the second round. So what happened? The old parties run to the Supreme Court, shout about anomalies they didn't happen to see on election day. This is a blatant derailment of an electoral process in a country with a long and bloody history of same. Why isn't it on our agenda? Do the Guatemalans matter less than the Venezuelans? Or is the real agenda here, as in Venezuela, protecting old money and vested interests? I condemn the attacks on Guatemalan democracy. The next round on August 20th better proceed.
Thank you. Sandra Pereira, the next speaker.
Thank you, President. This resolution on Venezuela insists on manipulating the facts and distorting reality. For more than 2 decades now, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has been subject to interference and aggression from the United States of America. It's tried to orchestrate the coup d'etat. It's tried to set up puppet governments. It's been subject to misinformation and a cruel economic blockade, which is aimed at damaging the standard of living of the Venezuelan people. That's why this Parliament seems to continue to insist. I mean, it seems that the Parliament will insist that there should be further interference in the 2024 elections. The European Union should respect international law and the respect for sovereignty of states, the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people to decide its own fate without foreign interference. We show solidarity with the Venezuelan people and its right to decide upon its own development to defend the Bolivarian revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Mick Wallace, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. The hypocrisy of those criticising Venezuela for alleged human rights abuses and blocking far-right opposition figures is astounding. You're silent on the brutal sanctions regime that have killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans since 2017. Not a word about the billions in Venezuelan assets stolen by Portuguese and British banks, money needed to save lives during the COVID-19 pandemic. The EU and US are worried about Venezuelan democracy, but we spent years recognising an unelected shadow government headed by an incompetent, clownish figure called Guaido, deeply hated by the Venezuelan people. We are collectively punishing the Venezuelan people for backing Maduro. They made the wrong choice, so they must suffer and die or change their minds. This is the logic of Western sanctions today. It's the most authoritarian action imaginable. Maduro should let the far-right opposition run an election, but the EU and US, where multiple communist parties are banned, and the US, where the Constitution blocks third parties from contesting the presidency, they don't really have much of a right to lecture Venezuela about anything.
Thank you, President. It's only 7 months since the Cattergate scandal broke in the Parliament. We had MEPs in jail, bags of cash seized, Brussels in uproar, everyone running around screaming, enough is enough, no more messing around, we're going to really make this place accountable this time. Well, this was our chance to show the public that we're serious. This report is supposed to be our main response to that scandal. But I have to say, from the left's point of view, while undoubtedly there are some very good elements in the report, overall it's a disappointment. Most people would be expecting that this report would put the Qatar scandal front and centre. It's there in the title, after all: transparency, integrity, accountability and anti-corruption. So it's really weird when you open it and find out that it's not so much about Qatar and corruption, but more about the usual favourite subjects: Russia, China, security threats, Reds under the bed and all the usual stuff, where we should be talking about influence such as revolving doors. The report calls for safeguards against interference through revolving doors by high-risk non-EU countries. Why only high risk? Before December, most MEPs wouldn't have even considered Qatar a high-risk country. If someone is interfering, surely that's wrong, whoever they may be. Why do we qualify it? We couldn't get an answer to that in the negotiations. It's a double standard regarding corruption and interference. In February, we had 2 resolutions of this Parliament passed calling on a ban on paid side jobs. Yet in negotiations, we couldn't achieve that. Now, in this report, all we have is stricter rules. What does that look like to people outside here? We're watering down the commitment that we gave previously. It really isn't good enough. Now, we have an amendment along with the Socialists and the Greens to restore that ban, and I'm really appealing to colleagues to support Amendment 23 and restore the ban. We need high standards, not double standards.
I voted in favour of this. On the 14th of June, over 500 people trying to get to Europe were declared missing, presumed dead, when their boat sank off the coast of Greece. This is just one of the string of such disasters, and there's been further deaths since. At the beginning of this mandate, this Parliament voted not to conduct search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. We decided to let people die at sea. And we've done dodgy deals with countries across North Africa, paying them to police our borders. A UN report in March raised concerns about the abuse of migrants arrested and detained in Libya. Instead of funding rescue, we're channeling money to bodies like the Libyan Coast Guard, who only last week were found to be shooting at migrants. People are dying to get to Europe. They're coming from countries that have been subjected to European colonialism, that have been ransacked with wars in which Europe played no good part. And we build higher walls to keep them out? Welcome to our European values.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Wallis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. And then to conclude on the same topic, Mrs. Daly.
This resolution. We hear an awful lot these days about the rules-based international order. Now, how European member states deal with migration is a great example of this, because what it means is international law is flagrantly violated, UNCLOS disregarded. The Geneva Convention, maritime law, Charter of Fundamental Rights, they're all just bits of paper that can be discarded, and European member states are allowed to get away with it. We've had no proactive state-operated search and rescue in the Mediterranean since 2014. Almost 28,000 people have died at sea in that time. That's 3 times as many civilians as have lost their lives in Ukraine. But of course, the people who've drowned in the Mediterranean don't count. The men, the women, the children, the babies who've struggled and gasped for breath, terrified as they die and lose their fight for life. They don't matter, do they? We kill them with impunity. We deny we're at war with them through sanctions or migration. Until we acknowledge that, we'll never get anywhere.